Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chart's webinar today, Diving into the Data, Hospitality Training Benchmarks and Insights. Today, we have with us panelist Chart board member Kelly McCutcheon, who is Group Director of Training at Whataburger. We have Chart President Damian Hant, Vice President of Talent Experience at Inspire Brands, and Francis Liu, Vice President of Marketing at Opus Training. Welcome, Kelly, Francis, and Damian.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Awesome. Shall we kick it off? Lisa, thank you so much for doing the intro. As Lisa mentioned, I'm Francis, and I'll be moderating this panel of experts, Damian and Kelly. And the purpose of today is to really dive into the data, because while the survey data is really important, it needs context, right? Like it needs to be interpreted alongside what's really happening today. And that's why we're leaning on them to really shine some light there. And so today the format is for us to all pick their brains. I'll tee up some questions to guide the conversation, but I think just to remind everybody, the discussion is really for you. So please chime in along the way. You know, you can either put comments in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask the question live. And not just questions. If you have a story or an example or point of view that you want to add to it, I think we all will welcome any of the stories as well. So with that, the agenda here is pretty straightforward. We're going to break it into 3 parts. One, how should we use the data and the insights that we've gleaned from the survey to think about how do we plan for the future of our managers? Right? Then we'll switch gears and talk about the hourly employees as well. And then lastly, you know, and in some ways, more importantly, it's really like, what do you do with this information? Like, how can you use it to your advantage in your job? How do you think about future planning? How does this relate to, you know, the work at hand? So we want to make sure we leave some time for to talk to Damian and Kelly in terms of how are they thinking through that as well. And so before we jump into the actual first section, just to warm people up, if you can raise your digital hand somehow, or maybe chime in the chat, who has read part 1 of the Hospitality Training 360 report? Pop quiz. We got Kelly, thank God, because otherwise this would be a really interesting conversation. Anything else? I'm not sure if I actually can see polls or the hands, but
Jennifer, Julius.
Yep, yeah. Several there. That's awesome.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I see you there. Well, great. And if not, it's totally fine. We'll be sure to recap it. And through this webinar session, you'll see some of the stats as well. So let's dive in. The future of managers, and the future really is now. So one, to set some context, we thought we'd bring up the training priorities for 2024, and we asked the question in the survey, what categories are your highest priority for training the next year? And overwhelmingly, everybody talked about management and leadership training as being really top of mind. And that was a big part of what we talked about in the survey, in the report in part 1. So maybe to kick it off, Kelly, what's your response in terms of why this response was so like ranked as top?
Great question. And if you're looking at this data for the first time, I wonder if you share my similar reaction, which is that I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit comforted by that, because it always feels good to be in the same boat with other people. You know, what did surprise me a little bit is that some of the other items here, basic job skills, workplace safety, things like that, didn't rank a little bit higher. But here's my theory behind why management is the top training priority in 2024. You know, if we look historically, just, you know, very recently over the last 4 years, we've seen a shift in our industry, or at least an enhancement in our industry, where we've focused a lot on internal promotions. So we have, you know, folks that are in management for the first time that might know our concept really, really well, but may not have brought with them, you know, the leadership skills that we expect when a manager in another concept joins your team. Along with that, I think we've seen an introduction of people coming into the industry for the first time. So we're not really getting those tried and true managers as much as we are getting internal promotes and people new to the industry. So that kind of creates this perfect melting pot of really a need for management and leadership training. I will share a quick story. It wasn't that long ago. It was a different concept. I'm still relatively new to the Whataburger world. I'm still counting months. I'm in month 15. But in a previous life, like it wasn't that long ago that I remember a Friday night, watching a manager who was working grill, teaching the fry cook right next to them. And it was their first shift on a Friday night, right? So we know that we have this need for ongoing training, and it's kind of this ripple effect from what we've seen historically. So that's kind of the internal view, but I know that there's a little bit of some environmental factors as well, right, Damien?
Absolutely. And I think two things kind of stand out for me. One being, as you kind of look at the top trends on here, if you will, I think those are admittedly the harder things to teach and to kind of build out. A lot of the other things tend to be the things that are a little bit more tactical, if you will, or technical. So skill set wise, it's harder to evolve with that. And then I think kind of feeding into what Kelly just mentioned, that it's also about the operating environment that we're all part of. I think that over the last couple of years, especially, I hate to say the word, but COVID, the environment changed a little bit and it morphed a little bit from what it was before. And what we knew to be true before 2020 isn't necessarily the case today. And as a result of it, I think a lot of us have been putting in additional focus and prioritization around what does it look like with the operating environment that is out there, and how do we equip people to best handle that? And oftentimes that starts with our folks kind of in the management area, but then kind of trickles into that whole customer service interpersonal area as well.
That's really interesting.
Oh, I was just going to chime in and say that you made me think, Damien, that I think we've relied for a really long time on legacy training, right? The passing down of knowledge generationally to generation, and we don't have that anymore. So we've got to document it. We've got to prioritize it. Back to you, Francis.
Well, and even too, that I think we saw a lot of I'll use almost a buzzword, I think, at this point, but de-escalation, which keeps coming up. And again, however, whatever context you use that in, but it's a thing that has always existed, but there hasn't been as much importance on it up until the last several years, where all of a sudden it's like everyone's asking about what are we doing about that? How do we look at it? How do we actually train for it? Because there's so many variables. And I think, as we'll see from some of the other data points within the report, technology is one of those enablers potentially to help in that area.
It's great. Thank you for sharing. And let's continue on, because I think you'll touch along and dive a little bit more in terms of some of these nuances going forward. So one of the things I wanted to tee up was an article that both Damien and Kelly wrote, and they took a really interesting spin in it, which it was taking the data that was presented and then imagining what that future can look like, right? So that we're not just stuck in today's world, but we're really trying to think bigger picture and breaking that mold. And so we thought we'd incorporate some of that here in the discussion to help everybody also sort of break out of that mold and really think a little bit more futuristic around what is possible. And so to tee it up, Damien, can you share the story that you guys wrote about sort of career pathing through everboarding?
Yeah, totally. So to your point, Francis, as we looked at the different trends, we're trying to break down of like, well, what does this actually mean, and like where are we headed as an industry? So we started to think about, well, let's just use our imaginations for a moment, because oftentimes we're thinking about the future and kind of working backwards to how do we get closer to that future, if you will. So we built out, what does that path look like for a manager? What does it look like for a team member, and so on? And from a manager perspective, just kind of looking at some of those trends, such as adaptive learning as an example, some of those trends such as continuous and ongoing learning, just in time, if you will, and thinking about from a manager perspective, you have a brand new person that comes on board. And today, oftentimes, some of the processes that we've known as being legacy, where it's asking them questions, it's setting them up with a standard checklist that we go through, probably doesn't exist as technology continues to evolve with the trends and where we're headed, where instantly right out of the gate, the person may come on and hopefully we already have some idea of where they came from. We have a baseline knowledge. Perhaps there was an assessment that was built into that whole thing. And I think if you're like us, oftentimes it's like, hey, we got our standard training program that's 6 weeks or 7 weeks or whatever it might be. the reality is it may be 4 weeks, 3 days for one person, and it might be 7 weeks, 4 days for another person. Entirely different just based on what the skills are, and then building that out. And I think that also goes back into the last chart that we saw, where depending upon how well or how much of a foundation from a technical skill perspective, it's going to change and adapt, and technology can enable what that might look like. And I think we need to continue to think about how do we think outside the box, if you will, to what could be, which also makes us more efficient, makes us more effective as trainers, versus kind of going through the same exact program that we've always used before in the past.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And I think in the story here, you sort of highlighted, and I'll quickly summarize it. It's like you had this manager come in the car. He's like checking his phone to get a quick tip of like, this is what the skill I'm really trying to think about, right? And then immediately apply it into the pre-shift, like going forward. And I think this idea of like incorporating little intentional moments to help them work on those skills throughout the day, and using, I think you said, like technology and these platforms to be able to facilitate that, can really help guide them sort of like and make sure that they're not just doing the job, but also thinking about like, how do they do their jobs better? Like, I thought this is an interesting one, because you're speaking about the manager too, where they're not in their four walls. Like, this is where they're actually coming outside, you know, and or like coming into their job, their shift. So like, what about managers do you think could really help the manager sort of experience itself, or the workflow? Do you feel like these trends really help, like can really help them in their day-to-day?
Yeah, I can chime in on that one. And you know, one of the things that inspired us to write this article, and by the way, we can, you know, following this call, we can link out the not only the blog that we wrote, but also the actual survey results, so you can check it out too. But one of the reasons we were really inspired to write it in the future is I think that our industry in particular is always a little bit behind the trend line, right? We felt like 5 years seemed like in the future, seemed like the right amount of time for today's innovations to show up as adoptions in our industry. And so, you know, right now there's a lot of continued buzz around things like microlearning. Everboarding has started to show up. And then, of course, we have all the enhancements that technology is giving us through artificial intelligence. And so we shuffled all of that together to this, you know, we think about development or even initial training as a period of time, like Damien said, you know, and then there's the doing afterwards. But what if we shuffled those things together, and through this data, what's important, what we're actually building towards right now? What if that became just integrated with your daily shift? And so the idea here with this story, this is, you know, with Sergio's story, is he's using his phone to help him run a better shift. It's going to provide him with some tips and a quick micro-learning training on praising and recognizing your team. And then he actually gets to apply that as a contributor to the shift. And I think that's, you know, that's a future that we all would love to see, where it's, you know, we don't separate the training and the doing, we actually integrate the two together. So I think that's what was really appealing, of where we saw this data leading us to this really awesome future.
Yeah.
I think where it's leading us, and then it reminds me of kind of thinking back in time. I think this is probably the case for many of us, depending upon how long we've been in the industry. But right now, there's so many different data points that are available to us within either our hotels, restaurants, and establishments, that when you aggregate all those together, they tell you something, and they, in a meaningful way, can help be predictive of what you should do and how you should be supporting individuals, which goes back into the technology itself, might be the enabler, if you will. But back in the day, many of us, it was like, hey, we would physically show up. You had to manually do an audit. You had to manually go through all these different processes, versus this day and age, you should, with some level of certainty, be able to predict what something's going to be like before you ever get to that point, because you have all these data points. The question just is, are you using all the data points in a way that's effective?
Right. And to add to that, it's because it's so individualized, and you can now do that, these tips that you're like coaching them on can be very specific based off all of that data that you claim to.
Totally.
That's great.
Which I think also connects even from a skills perspective back and forth, where sometimes we just assume that this is the ideal trainer. You start to look at the ideal trainer might be multiple people that, hey, I have a strong skill in this area. Kelly has a different strong skill. Francis, you have a different strong skill. So maybe we pair them up with multiple people, because we know that about our existing employee population. And we
Mhm.
don't have to necessarily be guessing what that is of what makes the ideal training plan, and automatically it just sorts and filters folks.
I love that idea. They talk about in a professional life, you should have a board of advisors just for yourself, because not everybody can solve all the problems, you know, that you need. So it's applying a team-like aspect and coaching for your individual employees as well.
Okay, I know I'm a panelist here, but I'm taking a note. Hold on, panel of okay, go ahead.
No, great. That'll give me a spot to transition to today. Let's go back to today, right? So we talked about the future, the context of like the lay of the land. We talked a little bit about what the future can look like. Now, to bring out some of the training data that will come out in next week. This is part 2 of the report. It'll include training costs / budget, and then a breakout on new hire and ongoing training in a couple of different cuts. We pulled out the ones for manager training today, and you can see on average, new hire role training for managers is about 200 hours. Ongoing training is about 47. The good news here across the board is there's been an incredible, significant increase from 2019, which is great news for everyone because it's it's clearly needed. But I would love to know from you, Kelly, like, you know, what's your take on this? You know, when you see the needs of today, the future of tomorrow, and the current training environment.
Yeah, cue The Greatest Showman, right? Never enough. So I love seeing the increase from 2019, but it just makes me go, I mean, I was in the industry in 2019, like, man, were we giving like minutes a day for ongoing training? When I see 47 hours in my head, that translates to less than an hour a week. And how do we interpret ongoing training? You know, do we include things like training limited time offers or you know, new product rollouts or new equipment? Probably. So that's probably using up the majority, if not all, of that ongoing training that we have, you know, that we're reporting has been afforded to us. This is, to me, this is the business case. This is the call to action for everybody on this call, because you know, a rising tide raises all ships. So I need you to do this, and I'm working on this. We have to write the business case for more. And it goes back to the story we told about Sergio, right? We have to find creative ways to integrate that development, because what we're hearing is, hey, I have a full-time job. It's called all the things that I do every day. I don't have time necessarily to focus on ongoing training, development, you know, all the things that are ultimately important, but are a couple steps removed from the to-do list that I have today. So this motivates me. I get really impassioned about 47 hours. Hashtag 47 hours. Let's make it trend.
Let's make it impactful. Damien, what are your thoughts?
Well, and I'll just pick off of, I saw Keith Strew in the chat. I had a comment there, and I think it relates well with this, because combine this then with the technology that's changing and evolving, coming back to the previous conversation. But it's many of us in the past have kind of did blanket training approach of like, hey, if we're focused on whatever communication or how to make our folks more effective or managing food costs or managing labor, whatever it might be, it's kind of like this blanket approach versus tailoring it towards the individual. So I think we can actually continue to be tight perhaps on some of these hours if they're effective hours that are being used. We can avoid kind of that masses piece, but it needs to be tailored then to the individual, kind of going back to the microburst piece, which is the unique needs that all three of us have are probably different. And therefore, how do we tailor then our training directly to those?
Yeah. So you're really using it effectively for every individual person beyond personalization, which makes a lot of sense, especially with how varied those managers' prior experience can be, right? And what other things are you thinking about in terms of how do you make that effective?
I love what Damien said, just to reiterate, you know, an idea of benchmarking, right? Okay, let's say, you know, all 1 hour a week, all 47 hours aren't created equal. So let's take that opportunity to make sure that it's customized. And I would say, let's try to separate the tactical training of a new LTO or a new product or service with, you know, that ongoing training that just helps you be better at your job, or be a better human.
And I think this data kind of reflects what we saw in the previous with management kind of being prioritized, if you will. And I think I'll just pick on Buffalo Wild Wings. They've had the year of the manager, quote unquote, is what they called it. And as part of that, it was really about investing and realizing, I think most of us probably heard this adage with whatever establishment we operate, but if you have a general manager, you typically have a location. It's rare that you'd walk in and have a poor running location, but a general manager that is running it. And I think this just kind of doubles down on the idea of how do we actually focus on that particular individual and reinvest in them? Because when you have the right person with the right skill set, everything else is way easier and the business runs a lot better.
Right, everything clicks into place. So what I'm hearing is, personalized experience, but also I think to Kelly's point, let's be really intentional about what is like knowledge, tactical training, like that's lumped into this ongoing training with like skills development and protecting that time and protecting that investment too. I thought this would be a good time to pause. Does anybody have questions from the audience or have thoughts of their own that they would want to add in? Like, what are you thinking about as you're reflecting on some of this data, the stories that Kelly and Damien shared?
I know there's a ton of innovators within the audience. I recognize a lot of the names.
Should we start name calling?
Exactly. So tempting.
Oh, good. If it comes later, we can always jump back into it. But I think for this, we got one question here. What tools are you all using to measure effectiveness of the training? That's a great one.
You want to rock, paper, scissors for this one, Damien? Or
You can kick it off if you like.
I'll start.
I'm good either way.
When we think about measuring training, and I will tell you at Whataburger, my team has heard a lot about training dashboard, training scorecard. This is something that we're starting to create. But when last year we rolled out a program that we called Train You, and we looked at a lot of different ways to measure. And we really followed Kirkpatrick's, now 5 levels. We had our market leaders go in and audit the success of training, and we taught them how to look for signs that training is happening, which can be really difficult, right? One of the challenges that we had was people sitting in front of a computer for too long, and so we really wanted to get more of that integrated training. So one of the signs we were looking for is that somebody wasn't sitting in front of a computer for more than 20 minutes. But I'll just wrap up. There's a lot of different ways. You have to figure out what's important to you. We measure by number of trainers in restaurants. Having 1,000 locations plus, we're looking kind of for those holistic metrics to help us know where to focus and dive in a little bit deeper. But I read an article recently that really inspired me. That it was a mother telling the story about how if she took the same measures that she had at work at home, she would measure how many smiles could she get her kids to do in a day, right? And then all you do is chase the smiles. So really finding ways to measure what matters. And I remember that she ended the article by saying, do you want to know the temperature in the room, or do you want to feel its warmth? And so I'm not necessarily going to tell you exactly what metrics to look at, but sometimes we over metric. And I would just say, remember that. Do you want to feel the temperature? Do you want to know the temperature in the room, or do you want to feel its warmth?
Love that. Very similar for us with everything as Kelly said. I don't want to beat a dead horse, as the saying goes, but I'll just throw out that each of our brands has some type of program that is almost Olympic type of feel with gamification. So there's the Blazing Games at Buffalo Wild Wings as an example, or the Sonic Dr. Pepper Games, Inspiring Smiles Challenge at Arby's. And basically they're a phased approach with training being kind of the foundation. And then from there, there's measurements then on, are folks actually delivering then on what the training intended to happen? So, and then we circle back when we're going through those different auditing or those different metrics afterwards of, hey, if this is not necessarily the intended outcome that we had, then where did we potentially miss the boat in the training process? So kind of looking at the outcomes from that perspective is one way to look at it, but obviously many other ways as well.
And that's great. I feel like this is in itself its own session to break out of, right? Because there's so many different objectives and levers and things that kind of layer up to it. I think one quick question that we got from the audience. And then there's actually some that I think we can address later, but it's a little bit around the challenge, specifically around, I mean, you want to invest in your managers, right? And I think this challenge specifically with California, but probably not isolated to California, is around just how tight it's expensive, especially with the increased minimum wage laws in California, but training is expensive, right? Just by time investment. So what other creative ways have you thought about in terms of changing things up to incorporate, to making sure that that's still incorporated?
So a little different way of answering it, I guess. My mind just jumps to the ROI piece, because us, just like everyone, I'm sure that's part of this conversation, it's focused on, at the end of the day, there's a finite amount of resources that are available. So when you train, as we all know, it costs money, resources, time, energy, everything else. And it's about like, what does that actually produce? So as much of it becomes prioritization, if you will, of like, what is it that we actually want to accomplish that will actually return on our investment? So playing out, and us, like many folks on this call, we have locations in California, and it really goes back into, what does it look like? How can we maximize? So some of it is making sure that we're extremely efficient with what we're doing. And in some cases, are we redesigning stuff that it's been a nice exercise of having us focus on, hey, if this thing takes 4 hours to do, are we actually looking at this right? Like, could we actually get as much, or could we get 80% there with half as much time? There's been some exercises that we've done kind of in that space to play with it.
I think to harp on what you said, like some of the bigger nuggets that will lead to long-term efficiencies around that personalization, but like shorter creative ones. And I think it may have been one of you who mentioned this in a different conversation around like, how do you tack on the need to do trainings like LTOs with then additional trainings on around skill development? Like, so you're really using the same time, but kind of pairing multiple skill sets like
100%.
it together. So that you're integrating it together and kind of like sneaking it in, like sneaking in the vegetables with like the
Putting
the
the spinach
pasta.
in the smoothie and the milkshake. If I could just add to that, I want to give a shout out to my team, because I think they do that really well. You know, we'll teach, here's how to write a great schedule, but secretly we're teaching time management skills and communication skills and having difficult conversation skills, because yes, I do need you to work that Friday night shift. And you know, it shows up, even though it's the surface level is very tactical. About labor management or things like that. So you can find ways. I love the sneak your vegetables. One other thing that I just wanted to bring up in regards to Dan's question and Audrey's tag on question about building the convincing use case for L&D investment. Training is your secret strategy. Training is never the result. Training is never the ROI. You have to find the thing that you connect your platform to. So for example, the Train You program that I was mentioning that we rolled out last year, yes, it was a whole rebranded training program, but everyone knew it as the turnover program, because we were on a quest to reduce turnover. And operators can buy into that business case because they understand, they feel the pain of it. They know the dollar amount that it costs. And so find what, training is always the middle of the Venn diagram, right? So find what you're connected to and build your business case off of that. It's never just, even when it comes to like diversity and inclusion, right? Yes, it's the right thing to do. We should create D&I training. It's the right thing to do, but build the business case for it because it's there, right? There's so many ways that will help increase your sales and reduce your turnover and all of these other elements that are important. So find out what's important to your people and then show them how your programs drive those results.
That's a great point. So there's interest in time. Let's move over to the employee side. And I think there's also even more, we'll continue to have more space to talk about how do we use this data or how do you build that case, but more broadly. So future frontline employees, I think similarly, in a similar format, let's talk about the context that we're operating in. We'll jump into another story and then how do we bridge that gap, right? So who's up? I think here, Damien. Management leadership was ranked really high, right? Coming in second and third is around customer service and interpersonal skills. I think we generally talk about this like soft skills being a need, and oftentimes I hear it's the younger generation, they don't really have the skills, it's a newer workforce. Like, what's your take? Do you feel like that's resonating, or is there other things that other factors that are having this becoming a top priority for everyone?
Yeah, so I agree that perhaps there's a change within the demographics that we're seeing, or the changing workforce. But I would also say that I also look at it as an external force that's happening with the customer base, or with folks that are then patronizing our establishments and locations. So with that said, it goes a little bit back to reframing of where folks are positioned even. So as you think about digital ordering or mobile ordering or all of that stuff come into play, is there as much of a need potentially for some of the things that we've done in the past? Or do we position them where the moments that matter are not what they were before? So being friendly might mean something different when someone's coming to just pick up a mobile order versus actually going through an entire service experience. The one other thing I would throw out is that as I look at this list, the aha that I had is that I don't know that it's just the things that we think about that are just explicit to our establishments, that, hey, I need to know this because it's part of doing the job. I think there's also an element there of how do we help set folks up for success with things that they want or yearn, aka I actually want to learn how to do fill in the blank. So it makes me think of, I think some of us have seen the same before, start here, go anywhere, with the idea being, hey, we'd rather have someone stick with us for 9 months rather than 6 months. And they're sticking with us for 9 months because we're giving them something and giving them a compelling reason to stay because they're learning and developing, versus leaving us after 6 months and going to one of our competitors that are out there. It's kind of a reframing of what we see here.
Yeah, that's great. Kelly, do you have anything to add here too?
Yeah, I think your question about the soft skills, it reminds me of Damien's answer about the environment that we're in, and how the times have changed. You know, I was driving to work the other day and I was thinking about some of the old adages that we used to say all the time, right? Things like the customer is always right, or people will come back if they've had bad food, but they'll never come back if they've had bad service. And I just think we don't live in that world anymore. And so people are recognizing, even if you have these long tenured employees, the need for customer service and interpersonal skills training simply to evolve, simply to get us to present day, because our customer is different and the skill sets that we need to tackle different situations is different, right? We're probably 2 steps closer to going into fight or flight than we were 4 or 5 years ago. And so I think that we need to develop a new set of skills to go hand in hand with that. And we think about where we are today. We don't have half an hour to provide hospitality. We have 15 seconds. We have TikTok hospitality, right? We have to hit it very quickly and make an impression very quickly. And people are going to determine within those 15 seconds if they're going to have a good experience or not. So
Yeah.
I think that's what we're dealing with.
I like that, the context there. It's not just that skills that need to be built. It's a totally different way of rethinking what those skills really look like. And so the training that you may have had before may not even be like the right type of training that you need for today's environment, or the different types of customer interactions that you're having. Switching gears then, if you're going to sort of take a step into, building for the future, different scenario planning. But Kelly, do you want to share in terms of, what the story was, and also why did this one in particular appeal to you as it relates to like the typical hourly employee?
Yeah, writing this story really challenged me because I'm true confessions. I've been a little anti-AI. I've watched the Terminator one too many times, I guess. But here's the story. So we painted a possible future for a new hotel front desk employee, LaToya. And while she received her tactical training through hands-on, with her trainer, she was able to develop skills through a VR setting. And we've all heard the saying that you should never practice on the guest or practice on the customer, right? But all too often that happens because we don't set up scenarios where you have an angry guest until you actually have an angry guest in front of you. And so essentially, fresh out of training, you know, she's graduated from this program of how to handle these particular common scenarios in the whole hotel industry. And then she hears that happening at the front desk, and she kind of picks up her pace because she goes, hey, I know how to handle this. And admittedly, when people started talking about virtual reality training, in our industry, I kind of scoffed at it because I was like, sorry, but the burger is real. Like I need to actually flip it to learn how to make it. But where I didn't think about the realm of possibilities was outside of tactical training. Like, sure, keep the tactical training tactical. But what about the interpersonal skills? What about all of the other things? You know, I think there is a space in the future for AI and virtual reality. And it creates this safe space, right? Where I can learn on my own, which is, by the way, what we're used to. You know, you get a tablet when you go to school now. So you're learning in a very introverted way. Why not adopt that in our industry?
Yeah. I can't see the person's name here, but I think to harp on or Julia's there, sorry. I think just to pull in some of the notes that have been happening in the chatter, which has been really great to see. I think just to highlight the customer service and interpersonal skills too, it's like, these are also long-term skills to employ. So whatever you're imparting in sort of investing, I think AR people, one, probably are a little skittish by the initial investment, like hard costs, like involved with that too, but then also the effectiveness. It's like, you can also think about the ROI there beyond just servicing a guest, but just more broadly, how do you work in a business environment, right? And or just like in life in general.
Well, to your point too, and to Julius's point, it really is our branding as an industry, which is the benefit of being part of our industry. And I think when you think out of the number of people that started off, and there's some statistics out there, depending upon when you look, but McDonald's has done a nice job in the past. I give them kudos for their 1 in 8 people in America have started their first job at McDonald's. I think it tells you something, and I think us showcasing the fact that there's transferable skills, and there's so many people that have left the restaurant industry that talk about what it meant to them as far as what they learned that they're able to apply later in life or throughout life for that matter.
Yeah.
Which is super cool.
That's great. Damien, anything else to add before we sort of jump to the next slide?
No, go right ahead. And we can go right into that.
No, fantastic. So this is more in line with what Kelly talked about, just like there's all these different trends that we've mentioned. Interestingly, to her point, AR, VR is something that ranked lower, but mostly just I think because people are still grappling with how to apply it, building the case on the ROI side of it, right? But I think also in that story was the fact that there was a lot of other these trends, continuous learning, micro training, how she like finished this program and then was able to jump in, etc. I'm curious from your perspective, Damien, how do you see these trends really interrelate with each other? How can you actually apply apply multiple of these approaches together so that you build a better program?
Yeah, in my mind, it still comes back to that customization of the tailoring of what the training looks like, which touches on each of these different points. And I want to comment just a second on AR and VR, but that I think at some point, and it's probably sooner than we think, it was interesting that a lot of folks talked about it being a trend that's happening, but not a lot of folks talked about prioritizing it. So it's kind of the two discrepancies that you saw within the data as we looked at it. And I think that some of the call out of that is that I don't think we know what to do with it yet. So Kelly alluded to this earlier, that there's a cost restraint, if you will, that's part of it. I think the other part of it is we're all kind of figuring out, and we all know that we're headed down this path, but what do we exactly do with it? So I think that ties back in with, as you actually look at ways that you can integrate this, and I think that Kelly's approach was spot on and 100% agree with it. I think of like de-escalation training once again, or something like that nature, where there's continual desire to build up muscle memory on like, hey, what do I do in this particular situation? But you can't get it because those situations never happen. And a relevant example that I think many of you can probably relate to is, at the end of the day, you have your marketing team that pushes out a product and you sell 2 of the things a day or 3 of the things a day. And then you get pushback of like, hey, they're not making it correctly. Well, yeah, because they work 5 shifts, 4 shifts a week. They may statistically make 1 of that product on their shift if we're lucky. And as a result, you can't appreciate or expect that they have the muscle memory to continually do it the right way because they saw it one time and then they never actually come back to it. And I think that that's where the technology can help us get some of that repetition that actually builds up muscle memory to have success.
Right, right. Especially those moments that don't happen often, probably the most critical ones. And so it has an outsized impact when it does happen, right? And if you don't get it right. And so like you have to balance those two.
Totally.
The second step we wanted to bring up was, again, bringing out, like, this is the current training environment, similar to the managers. A similar story, as in there's been a significant increase for, on the whole, frontline, front of house and back of house training hours spent. For new hire training, that's 35, ongoing training is about 26. We've seen it even out, anecdotal in the data too, between back of house and front of house, which is historically, I think, maybe a little bit of a shift pre-pandemic versus now. I'm just curious, Kelly, I'm trying to look at my notes here. What's your thoughts on the current environment? I think similar to the managers, like, do you see are there shifts that need to be done to be able to bridge that gap if you want to incorporate more of that vision that you've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, can we just pause and have a moment of kudos for what all of us can do with 35 hours? Like, it's amazing that, on average, we have 35 hours to train a new hire, and we are doing more with less, right? We're cross training. You have all of the customer service skills that go along with that. So it's not just tactical training. In addition to that, at Whataburger, these are the things that everybody needs to know how to do. So we want to make sure you're a contributor really from day one. So we have all of that new hire training, but really in your first 5 hours, you should be able to run food, clean restrooms, say hello and goodbye, things like that. Where I again bring my focus is the ongoing training, and I just think, this needs to shift. And we painted the picture of a possible future, but I don't really know what that looks like. Do we shuffle these together and try and spread that out? Do we make conscious investment? I'll tell you at Whataburger, we're currently doing time and motion studies, right? We have the tug of war that you all probably feel, where we say, here's your budgeted amount of hours to do training. And it's like, that's not even realistic for the structure that we provide. So how do we figure that out? Because where's the investment and where's the return? So
Right.
yeah, I see the same story. What about you, Damien?
Yeah, very similar. Again, kudos that we're able to do this. And this goes back probably to the point of how do you convince leaders the value of training, if you will. I think for starters, and this probably ties in with the last section that we're about to jump into right now, but ultimately taking reports like this and looking at data of what others are doing. And coincidentally, for us, as this report was coming out, I was being asked questions internally of like, hey, how does this compare? Because if we're being honest, some of our training programs or brands have been using the same number of hours, quote unquote, forever, for 20 plus years. So the question is, are we doing anything different, or are we actually adapting, or is this in line with what other folks are doing?
Yeah. I think that the similar thing about personalization is probably also true in terms of like, how do you make this more effective, right? And I think that also comes then down to the data. And I'm going back to Michelle's question around how do you capture ground on the floor, or how do you capture on the floor training data to know like where are the gaps, like where are people falling short, or maybe even teams and cohorts, so that you could really hone in on the skills that really need to, can make a difference. How are you? Yeah, what Kelly's eyes just got real big. What are some ways that you've seen done well, or you do yourself, or?
I'm working on building a magic wand. I don't, I think there are those that are doing it well. And I think we have to walk a fine line, right? I don't know that we would be better off if we had all the hours in the day afforded to us. I think we still need to prove to be efficient while looking for ways to make the investment. But, similar to what Damien said, I know this is just a snapshot of all the data that we collected. And I would really encourage everybody on the call to take a look at the data, because it will help you. How many times are you in a meeting and somebody's saying, well, what's this company doing about that? What's so-and-so, or, wow, we've been asked to really tighten our belt, our purse strings or things like that with, in this area. I've heard that other companies are doing it this way. Having this industry benchmark is really helpful to see, one, how you compare, but two, where you may need to invest. And it's really inspired us to take a look at our end-to-end career journey, as well. So Damien, I don't know if you have anything.
No, and I'll add to that, which might just summarize this last section as we kind of close out on time here. But ultimately, from a chart perspective, I can't tell you the number of times that I have reached out to other members of chart and simply ask questions around, hey, I see the trend says this is what we're actually using. What are you guys using? And then, hey, why is there a gap between how we're approaching this and what is happening? And how are you then more efficient or more effective, perhaps, than what we are? And vice versa. Here are the best practices that I have that I then could share out. I think that chart offers a great forum for that. And the one other thing I'll throw out is the blogs that we have out there around these training trends. There's also the ability to be able to share feedback and ask questions throughout that process and ask my peers. I think that that sometimes is one of the most helpful ways to be able to look at those efficiencies, because as you go through those fixed number of hours, I think we all have had probably experiences like this too, that you have one manager perhaps that is like a rock star when it comes to executing whatever the training is, and then you have someone else that's not. And hey, you have same variables here, like it takes the same number, you're giving them the same number of hours, giving them the same program, you're giving them the same stuff, but yet one's way more effective than the other. It goes back into, is there a way that we can do a better job from a systematic perspective or from a technological perspective of supporting to make that a more aligned and more universal experience that every team member has, versus it just being one person over here with a great manager.
And this is a little bit off topic, but as we start to wrap, I want to thank our fourth panelist, which is you. All of the comments that you provided really helped to shape this conversation, and we have a little bit of time to keep it going, but I really want to thank all of you for contributing. I've taken some notes, I'm learning things, and that's one of the reasons we do these things, right? It's certainly an investment, but you all are the subject matter experts. And I would also say that that's much in due part to Francis encouraging you and taking that moment in the middle of this to ask for questions. So one of my takeaways in full transparency is, how often do we have meetings and we wait until the end to ask for questions? Ask your questions in the middle, then you start the conversation. I really, really love that as a part of this this conversation today. So thank you.
That's cool. A great note, Kelly. And the little queue isn't closed yet, but maybe just to wrap it up, I would love to hear from your perspectives. Each of you, what are you thinking sort of future for your company? Like, how are you thinking about the future for both managers, employees, or just even your L&D team? This is like a pop question.
Yeah, totally. So I'll just double down, and it's probably been a theme that I've shared in a couple different comments here, but just on connecting all those different data streams. So it kind of goes back into how can we get more predictive. So building out skill profiles. And again, a lot of folks outside of the hospitality industry is where I'm finding actually a lot of experiences in this area of building out what skills look like, and then connecting those dots of, based on proficiency within those skills, what skills then are opportunities for us to do a better job of providing learning experiences to align with. And if you want to take a step further, it also goes back into, with enough data points, you can start to look at what does that training experience look like as far as who's the person that's delivering it? What do they then have? Could we pair up that, hey, if Kelly and I both worked for a same brand someplace in a previous life, maybe it makes sense for us to be together because we have shared vocabulary and experiences that then make it easier and more efficient and faster for me to learn because I can relate instantly to what Kelly is saying. So we're looking at how do we connect those different points to hopefully connect with technology to speed up and make it more efficient.
Super interesting. Kelly, what about you?
For us, so how much time do we have? No, I would say a couple of things. I think one, we're being really intentional about what we create ourselves and what we outsource. There's currently a lot of really great resources out there. so we're thinking about, where do we want to have our specific thumbprint, and where can we just plug and play some great resources. I think that, again, I mentioned that our industry is kind of the at the end of that change curve, but a lot of companies are providing what we need in terms of really specific micro-learning training. So similar to what Damien, you said about, I think you said success profiles, we have success metrics and those specific competencies that lead to success. So much success. Sorry, I said the word success a lot that it's sounding weird now. And then how do we take that competency and tie it to evaluating how good I am at it, so that I can then have custom training that helps me develop, if one of those competencies is communication, and let's face it, everyone's competency is communication somewhere, that could mean a whole myriad of things. And so how do I first evaluate how I am? I might be great at one component of it, and then maybe I need to learn how to be concise in my speech, so I can provide specific targeted training to that one subsect of that competency. And that's something that we're looking at for our ongoing leadership development training. I think that customization that Damien was talking about.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah, you guys are speaking about customization in a couple of different levels. But ultimately it's really being surgical with how you develop those skills versus being just very more generic, right? For that individual. That's fantastic. Well,
Wonderful.
how do you
Yeah.
how do you make that automated?
Francis, you okay if I wrap up?
let's do it.
Okay, this was very insightful. We're so appreciative of the preparation that you all put into this today, and for Opus, for your continued partnership to help us all illuminate the way, in hospitality training and the trends for the future. I put the link to the blog articles that we referenced and the link to download the research right in the chat if anyone would like to access them before we end. An evaluation is going to be sent to all of you right after this webinar. We very much value your feedback, and we hope you can access all of the resources of CHART in the future, and that we see you at a conference or at a future webinar. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
We'll see you in the
Join us.
future.
That's right. See you in the future. Thanks for joining
Thank you.
us.